Early this September, the US Congress Subcommittee on Intelligence and Special Operations proposed to include South Korea, Japan, India, and Germany in the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. So there might be a possibility of expansion of the Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing arrangement between Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. But India is the only country among those recommended for expanded intelligence sharing that does not have a treaty alliance arrangement with the United States. This is what Mohammad Zishan has written in his recent article. So here we have today with us Mohammad Zishan to interact more on his recent article and also his recent book, Flying Blind, India's Quest for Global Leadership. Welcome, Zishan.
Thank you, Kavita. Happy to be here.
So, well before the current wave of interest in expansion of Five Eyes, you had already proposed that India should be included in this alliance. So, Zishan, tell us more about what is this intelligence alliance and what are the privileges and benefits that India could get if it joins it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that this has become a thing now in India because of all the different proposals and ideas that I had in my book. I think I would say this was probably the most radical thing that I put out there. I mean, I don't think anybody at that point in time was even thinking about having India in the Five Eyes. But to me, I think that it felt like the natural progression of India's relationship with the US. In my book as well, I say that in many ways, India is a Western country with Eastern clothes. We are Asian by ethnicity and geography and culture and all of that. But at the same time, we are a Western liberal democracy, so to speak. Unlike most other countries in Asia. And we've got the largest English speaking population of any country in Asia. In fact, by some estimates, we are a bigger English speaking country than even in the United States. So, in many ways, I thought that it was a natural progression of this relationship between India and the West. You asked me what benefits we might actually have. If you look at what the Five Eyes are, they are essentially an intelligence sharing community of these five countries. There you've got the US, you've got UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. All of them are essentially speaking Anglophone or English speaking countries. And so they've got that cultural similarity. And if you look at international relations, people generally think of international relations in a very cynical sense. Countries are always trying to, sort of take advantage of each other. But these five countries, or these Five Eyes as we call them, are in some sense the closest that you've got to a close best friends, no secrets club, so to speak. They share all kinds of intelligence with each other all around the world. Now, if India was to join the Five Eyes, so to speak, you're looking at India being part of the closest knit, tightly knit intelligence sharing community in international relations. You've got access to top of the shelf intelligence from the US and UK in particular, who have got global presence around the world and do intelligence gathering around the world. And at the same time, you've also got technology and training from the top of the shelf, because if India joins the Five Eyes, then the Five Eyes are going to be invested in capacity building, so to speak, India's intelligence agencies and intelligence gathering capabilities. And I think that this is very pertinent for India because in the past, particularly in the border areas, whether it's regarding cross-border infiltration out of Pakistan, or even more recently the border incursions from China, India has had intelligence problems. That's why we are not able to, so to speak, prevent a lot of the terrorist attacks that take place in many parts of particularly Kashmir, as well as are unable to thwart or preempt a lot of the border incursions that take place from the Chinese side as well. Now, we are able to improve and boost our intelligence capabilities, and we're able to get access to better technology and better training and skill sets, as well as collaborate with the US and the UK in particular that have presence around the world. I think it would tremendously boost India's ability to actually anticipate a lot of these threats ahead of time. And outside of the subcontinent, as I explain in my book, it would actually help India become a much more proactive player in Africa and Latin America, in Eastern Europe, around the world, particularly in areas of the world that are somewhat problematic and prone to crises.
So you have like clearly laid out that these are the benefits that India might get, but still you also have brought to fore some reasons that why India may still be hesitant to join the intelligence alliance in a formal sense. So what are these reasons?
Well, look, I mean, India has an allergy for alliances with any country. It's not personal to the US or anybody else. India has, throughout its independence history, for the most part, except for the time when Indira Gandhi, as Prime Minister, had signed a treaty with the Soviet Union before the 1971 war with Pakistan. Apart from that, most part of India's history, India has been pretty much allergic to alliances, so to speak. And the reason for this is because we see an alliance as a commitment. You don't want to commit. It's like getting married to another country, so to speak, in the psyche of Indian strategic thinking. And you don't want to make that kind of commitment to another country, particularly countries like the US that have got interests around the world. And in the case of the US in particular, I think one of the reasons, as I point out in my article as well as in my book, is that the US has a tendency to get militaristic around the world. There could be a war with China over Taiwan or over South China Sea. There could be a war with Iran in the Middle East. There could be deployment of forces. And at that point in time, if India is a treaty partner, the US is going to ask India to deploy its own troops on the ground as well, just as it happened with the UK and Canada and Australia and others during the Iraq War, for instance, and the many wars that the US fought before that as well. Now, India can get into a treaty alliance without these sorts of commitments, and India would have to then negotiate that separately. But the US tends not to tolerate, countries within its alliance group that do not want to also invest in defense and military. We saw that, when Donald Trump was president, he kept talking about why should we pay for Japan's defense or South Korea's defense or even the EU's defense? Why not? Why don't they also pay for their own defense and then fight our wars for us as well? And this is exactly what happened during the Iraq War when New Zealand, actually, as a treaty partner of the US, New Zealand refused to deploy troops in Iraq under George W. Bush. And as a result of that, there were several repercussions that I recount in my book as well. In the relationship between the U.S. and New Zealand, New Zealand actually ended up losing a number of things, particularly on immigration and trade and other things, in its relationship with the U.S. as a fallout, so to speak, of the Iraq War. So India doesn't want to get into these sorts of militaristic commitments with any country in the world, including the US. We don't want to start deploying our troops around the world just to support US national interests in different parts of the world, particularly since we don't actually see eye to eye with the US yet on many of these things. I mean, I don't think India would ever want to fight a war with China over Taiwan. All that India cares about, so far as the China threat goes, is that there is peace in the Himalayan border. If there is peace in the Himalayan border, regardless of what China does to Taiwan or Hong Kong or even Japan, I don't think India is really going to be as invested and interested as the US is. So there are significant differences, I think, on a number of these issues that India has with the US.
Yeah, but despite these differences, you have mentioned that the strategic convergence, which is increasing with US and the situation in Indo-Pacific and the sort of democratic angle to this coalition, they can add to, at the end, leading to some sort of India's participation in the strategic alliance. Can you elaborate on these factors?
I think that's what the long-term trend is going to be, in my opinion. I mean, if you look at what I've written in my book, for instance, one of the things that I argue is that it is in India's interest as an emerging power to actually support human rights and democracy causes around the world. In fact, I go on to argue that India has a bigger realist incentive to support democracy and human rights causes around the world than even the US does. India has a bigger incentive to stand up for Taiwan than the US does. India has a bigger incentive to stand up against the military junta in Myanmar than the US does. And I explain why this is the case at length in my book as well, for several reasons, including the fact that India has a large diaspora abroad and other factors. And so, my sense is that if you look at the basic interests that India has as an emerging power, I think it is in India's interest to have trade and globalization, for instance, because that is what has been responsible for India's own economic growth since 1991 reforms. It is, I think, in India's interest also to have sort of a proliferation of pro free market liberalization policies around the world. Because a lot of Indian businesses are now starting to invest abroad. TVS has now recently opened up, as I write in my book, a manufacturing industry in Southeast Asia. Tata, I think, is going to do the same, and then Indian businesses are also doing very similar sort of investment in parts of Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, the only way to actually support and promote the interests of Indian businesses abroad is through a standardization of liberalization policies, trade and globalization policies around the world, which is what institutions that are backed by the West, such as the World Bank and the IMF and others, are actually doing. So there is, I think, in the long term, a very significant strategic convergence between India and the US. At the moment, India is not very articulate, or rather, India has not articulated a lot of these positions on the world stage. We have not been vocal about what we want. But my analysis in my book is that on the basis of the fundamentals of the Indian economy and the fundamentals of Indian national power and the way that India functions as a country, on the basis of all of these factors, I think that all of these things are actually strategic interests in the long term for India. And so, therefore, India should be able to find common ground with the US, if not today, then 5 years from now, if not 5 years from now, then 15 years from now. But I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, and then focusing on your book, Flying Blind: India's Quest for Global Leadership. So, how necessary is the global leadership position for India, especially after the collapse of Kabul?
Look, I think the question that we've got to ask is, why does India want a permanent seat in the UN Security Council? And the answer to that question is also the answer to the question that you asked. Now, many Indians don't take foreign policy seriously, but pretty much all Indians at this point in time want to see India have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. I write in my book actually that compared to a lot of other countries that want a permanent seat in the Security Council, India is the most vocal and invested of them all. If you look at the Indian Permanent Missions website at the UN, for instance, in New York, you'll find that Security Council reform is actually posted and written and labeled about much more, prominently than on the permanent mission websites of countries like Germany or Brazil or Japan, which are the other countries that are aspirants to a Security Council seat. And the Indian Prime Minister tends to talk about a permanent seat in the Security Council much more frequently and much more vocally than the Japanese Prime Minister or the Brazilian President or the German Chancellor. So, why is it that India wants to have a permanent seat in the Security Council? It's because India wants to enjoy power and influence and be part of global decision making on crises around the world. Now, why does India want to have a voice in global crises? Why can't we just mind our own business? Why do we want to be up there sitting in the Security Council where they are talking about, Somalia and Ethiopia and Yemen and Afghanistan and all of these other crises that are actually pretty far away from our shores? It's because India has now a much more global economy. It has a much more global diaspora. In fact, if you look at Ministry of External Affairs statistics, there are only 3 countries in the world where there is no person of Indian origin or an Indian citizen residing. Every other country in the world has got a person of Indian origin or an Indian citizen. One of those 3 countries, by the way, is Pakistan. The other 2 are not in South Asia. They are small city states in Europe, which readers will find out when they read the book. So India has, I think, a very global set of interests. We want to care about access to opportunities for all of these Indians abroad. We want to give them a stronger passport so that they are able to work more easily. They are able to access education abroad more easily. Immigration, therefore, is a very important objective of Indian foreign policy. And at the same time, even here at home, we want to have trade deals and trade agreements that are actually more favorable to farmers and factory workers and fishermen here in India. So all of these things require the Indian government to have more bargaining chips. It requires the Indian government to have more leverage for negotiation, and that means that India has to have influence in what goes on in other countries around the world, and that is what I call the quest for global leadership. That is why India wants to have a permanent seat in the Security Council as well.
And you also mentioned in your book about the secret sauce for India to maintain its ties with sworn enemies like Saudi and Iran, US and Russia, is sitting on the fence. Where do you see current Indian foreign policy going? Is it still about sitting on the fence or joining a side?
Well, look, I mean, in my book, I actually wrote about fence sitting as being a secret sauce in a somewhat tongue-in-cheek manner. The argument that I make after that paragraph is that India is a weak global power, or that India lacks global influence because it sits on the fence. Now, the only way to actually gain influence in other countries is to do things that matters to them. Now, think about this. Why would a South African want to see India become a world power? A South African would want to see India become a world power because India as a world power is useful to a South African. So then we need to start doing things that are actually useful to South Africans, that are useful to Brazilians and other countries, around the world. You cannot do that in geopolitically sensitive, disputed areas of the world, which are almost every area in the world, if you do not take a stance on key disputes. South Africa has its own set of disputes with its own neighbors, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and others. Obviously, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has got a set of disputes with every country on its, in the region. It's got a dispute with Iran. It has a dispute with Syria under Assad. It has a dispute with Lebanon. So the only way that India can actually cultivate influence is by taking a stance on many of these disputes and taking sides in many of these disputes. You might, in some cases, make enemies, but in other cases, you will make friends. The only way to be a credible global power is to take stances based on a coherent set of principles, a consistent set of principles. If you are not consistent, nobody is going to trust you. If you're going to say one thing today and another thing tomorrow, nobody is going to trust you. If you sit on the fence, nobody is going to take you seriously because you don't matter. Or worse, they will actually distrust you because they are going to start thinking, okay, when India becomes a powerful member of the Security Council tomorrow, is India going to start acting against my interests? And so then both allies and enemies are going to become, in many ways, distrustful of you. And so, as I wrote in a number of other articles in the international media, as well as in my book, India then becomes at worst a case of sabotage and at best a bystander in a street fight. So the only way to gain influence is to take sides. Now, is Indian foreign policy actually moving in that direction? To be honest, I'm very skeptical about this. On the one hand, you do have Prime Minister Narendra Modi actually coming out in his very early days as Prime Minister, actually, in 2014-15. He spoke to a gathering of Indian ambassadors and senior diplomats, and he said, I don't want India to be a balancing power, I want India to be a leading power. Now, what he essentially meant was no more sitting on the fence, which is what balancing act means. I want you to start leading on global issues and disputes and taking a stance. But India has not yet crafted, in my opinion, a set of interests for itself. If you want to take a stance on global issues, you need to first know what you need and what you want from that global issue. You need to know what your interests are. And then you need to start to take policy decisions that are actually based on that set of interests. But India has not yet, in my opinion, actually made these sorts of fundamental choices in its foreign policy yet, which is why you see a lot of dilly-dallying and U-turns. Take Sri Lanka, for instance, where you've got the Tamil dispute that has been raging for several years. Even the previous government under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had committed a number of U-turns on this issue. One year we would vote against Sri Lanka at the UN, the next year we would vote in favor of Sri Lanka, the third year we would abstain, the fourth year we would vote against them again. So, there has been this tendency, and this is true for the Maldives, this is true for Myanmar, this is true for any part of it's even, I think, in many ways true in the Middle East as well, where we have tended to dilly-dally, for instance, on the issue of nuclear weapons in Iran, where we've tended to be somewhat ambiguous on whether we think Iran should have nuclear weapons or they should not. It's not very clear what India thinks. I don't think even Iran knows what India thinks. So India needs to start sort of crafting these basic, fundamental, I should say, foundation stones in its foreign policy, so that it's able to start taking a stance on these disputes.
Thanks, Zishan. Thanks for sharing your analysis of the proposal for expansion of the Five Eye and also answering questions from your book. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Kavita. An absolute pleasure.